Hello, everyone, and welcome to Skills-Based Health Ed on Demand. We are getting ready to start part of our National Health Standards series, and we're going to focus today on Standard 7, which is self-management, and we are brought to you today with our friends from MOSHAPE, DESE, and Missouri Healthy Schools. And I am Kim Goforth. I am the Health and PE Coordinator up in the Columbia Public School District, and I'm here with the best in the land, Mr. Brad. How you doing, Brad?
Hello, everyone. Hi, Kim. Happy to be here.
Very good, very good. Well, let's take a little peek at what we're going to be diving into today with Standard 7. Here are our learning outcomes. We're going to talk about the components of Standard 7, and Standard 7 has two components, actually, that we're going to walk through today. We're going to look at what mastery looks like for some of the performance indicators in Standard 7, and then we're going to spend some time looking at instructional planning and then practice opportunities for students to get Standard 7's performance indicators available for mastery for our students. So let's dive in, and we've got a little helpful guide here for you that we've prepared. Brad and I put together training guides for these sessions that you can help facilitate some of your learning, and you can access this training guide by going to the description in the YouTube going to the description in our YouTube link that we have there. There is a link. You can either print it so you can handwrite it on there if you like old school copies like Brad and I, or you can download it, and we've got some fillable boxes there that you can type in there. But we will mention that either way you go, there are some links provided at the training guide that you can access readily there for you. So let's dig in. Brad, walk us through Standard 7 and what that looks like.
Yeah, so self-management is described as students will demonstrate the ability to practice health-enhancing behaviors and avoid or reduce health risk. So this is about building personal responsibility, which is about our students taking ownership, taking ownership of their own health practices. It's about students having the ability to also manage oneself, which is all about using those health practices to avoid those risky behaviors, reduce health risk. And the standard has two main components. And the first is being able to demonstrate the healthy practices. And then the second one is responsibility. Okay. So we're going to break those two components down. Again, component one is being able to demonstrate those health practices. And we want our students to be able to demonstrate these healthy practices and these behaviors so that they can maintain or hopefully improve their personal health or others. And so we're really trying hard in our skills-based health classroom to not only empower the student themselves, but to empower them to make a difference in their families and communities. And so a simple example of this would be eating regular meals, right? Not skipping meals, having a consistent diet. And so demonstrating the behaviors to avoid or reduce a health risk is different. That example would be wearing a helmet. And so that health practice is helping us avoid a risk or an injury. And so as we move forward, you'll see a couple more examples related to personal hygiene. You'll see those health practices that are going to improve their health, right? Brushing our teeth, those simple health practices that we want all of our students to have, because if they don't, it makes our classroom learning experience not as enjoyable. And then we see some examples for a secondary sexual health unit, which would be those health behaviors to help us avoid risk. So you can see the examples of using condoms, getting tested, using our refusal skills, all great examples of health practices for our self-management Standard 7.
Absolutely. And Brad, this health practices is such a broad total person concept. And so I think as health teachers, we have to be very mindful about how we need to hone the focus a little bit for our students, because when we talk about maybe just the health triangle, we can have health practices thrown at every single corner of that. And so it'd be very helpful for teachers to use some data to help narrow that focus for students. And so I think that using very specific databases, giving kids the true numbers on where we need to focus some of these health practices, so then they can demonstrate that specific focus. And so, I think back to our COVID year that we've had. I think a lot of us have used CDC information and data to navigate that journey. And so we started early, I know here in Columbia, with conversation about hand washing, especially for our littles. Did we know how to do the hand washing? Sure. But maybe we needed to, really fine tune that focus to say, here are the steps. Let's review those steps of hand washing. And then the demonstration of that practice could come into play. And so I think it's very helpful to ground yourself in some data to narrow that focus for health practices, because it's pretty massive when you look at all the health practices we want to get to kids. So great use of data there.
Yeah, and I know in Springfield, when we review our youth behavior risk survey, I know that the tobacco and the vaping data has guided us towards more skills-based education and activities around refusal skills and our drug prevention unit. And so that's another example of how data has kind of guided our instruction and being more intentional in planning activities. So great point. We don't have enough time to teach all the health practices. So what Kim just shared is a great way for us to try to find out how we're going to prioritize those health practices. So component 2 of standard 7, we said that there's demonstration of health practices is component 1. Now component 2 is personal responsibility. And component 2 is going to look a lot like a lot of our other standards that we've reviewed, to where they're going to give us goals of personal responsibility and steps to teach personal responsibility. And I think that it's a great thing to break down such a large and important topic of personal responsibility. But I think the health classroom is a great space for it. So goal number 1 is all about identifying the responsibilities that students can take ownership of and manage on their own. So what do they have control over? And some simple examples that fall very natural in the health classroom, such as staying hydrated. So again, helping students simply identify what responsibilities exist in their life that they can take ownership of and manage on their own. Goal 2 is about determining and demonstrating those practices and behaviors and skills that they need to take ownership of their responsibilities. So we've identified the responsibilities. Now we're going to determine and demonstrate those practices. Next would be goal 3. We're going to turn those practices and behaviors that we identified and that now we've demonstrated, and now we're going to make them a habit. So now we're going to make them regular, consistent, and appropriate. So we're turning those into healthy lifestyle habits. And you can see again that understanding when and why to use those practices is very important in order to make those skills consistent or those practices consistent. And so those are the 3 different goals of personal responsibility, kind of broken down to kind of help us with the huge task of helping students learn and master personal responsibility.
Great. That's a helpful breakdown, Brad, because like you said, it can get pretty big. And so specifying goals, I think, is very helpful for this particular skill and standard. And so as we reflect back on goals, kind of the why are we here? Why do health teachers teach what they teach? And so if we kind of compile all of our goals across some of our professional organizations, these are our standard goals of health ed. So maintaining those healthy behaviors, addressing the unhealthy ones, delaying onset of the risky things that you've talked about, and really becoming a health literate human. And so when we connect these goals and answer the question, why is this particular standard 7 so important? How do these 2 overarching goals of health ed, how is it met with the standard 7? And so, you've talked about the bigness of self-management. And I really think that it's, my dad used to say, would you handle yourself, like get yourself together. I think that speaks to the standard 7. And so it gives students and an adult still the acceptance of, I accept that this is healthy for me. I accept that I'm avoiding this, risky behavior. And I can, it just really promotes the acceptance of health practices that we may have known, but that demonstration piece, I think it can really connect us to being a health literate person and managing ourselves and handling ourselves. So I think that's a very strong connection that I would find here with this particular standard to our health goals. Brad, do you have any other aha moments for you with Standard 7 in this?
I'd say more of an opportunity. I think COVID has taught many of us to understand the importance of kind of figuring out what is in my control. Like, what do I actually have control of? Because so much in the last 12 months we didn't have control of. And everyone was faced with that, and kind of we faced it at the same time. And so I think applying what we've learned about, okay, focusing on what we can control with our health practices is a great opportunity to kind of transition our students post-COVID. And what are some other things that we don't have control of that we need to let go and focus on this we do have control of? Okay, let's demonstrate that health practice and let's see how we can make it a consistent practice. I think that's one aha our students may have post-COVID, and how can we leverage that to our advantage for our students?
Right. Wonderful. Great connection. Now we offer you a chance to do some reflecting and make some connections. So on your training guide on page 1, we have an opening activity that really asks you to do the same. Make some connections from Standard 7 to the overall goals of health education. And that is again on page 1.
Excellent. So we're going to jump into the vertical grade level progression. I find this helpful, especially as a coordinator when we're looking at this standard holistically. And I also think it's helpful if you're a middle school teacher. It's nice to know what those students are coming into your classroom with, what the focus has been prior to them coming to your classroom, and then what will be the next focus, because some of your students may be ready for that next focus. So as you can see, pre-K all the way to 5th grade, it's all about focusing on identifying those responsible health behaviors. So we're just trying to find out what am I responsible for? And then in 6-8, we're starting to connect and explain the importance of taking on ownership of those responsibilities. And then you can see the verb shift into high school, where we're starting to analyze the role of those responsibilities for enhancing our health. So really taking ownership and really analyzing that role. When we break down the performance indicators for our secondary health classrooms, you can see that in middle school, we're asking them to explain. So notice the verb there on 7.8.1. We're just wanting them to explain the importance of those responsibilities, to where in high school, we're asking them to analyze. So again, I'm just asking you to notice the difference in the verb there, because I think that plays a big part in when we are planning our instruction and our assessments. And then again, I just want to point out the most common verb we see is demonstrate. So we've talked about that a lot so far with this standard. And again, you'll see it reflected in the performance indicators. Demonstrate, 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 demonstrate.
Brad,
Yeah.
one notice that I did have from 6-8 to 9-12 here on the demonstrate, I've noticed that at the 9-12 grade span, it talks about a variety of health practices. Yeah, and so it's that data piece that I talked about. So you're really fine tuning, I think, at 6-8, where you may only have a select handful of those healthy practices and behaviors. And then in 9-12, I feel like, the older students you can kind of blow that out and say, what's coming at them, being a little bit older, young adults, things that they're facing look a little bit different. And so that variety should probably open up a little. So I think that was just one notice that I thought worth mentioning there. I think it's important to open that up, because they're all going through something a little bit different. So just another notice.
Great notice, Kim.
All right, so we're going to give you a chance to notice some things maybe about your particular district, maybe your particular students that you have. And so if you take a peek at all of the performance indicators like Brad just put out there for you, pick something that's near and dear to your heart. Where would you like to focus your students, your district, and answer these 3 questions on page 2. Take a little reflective time, and you will use this performance indicator as you walk through the rest of our session together. So pause the video, take the time you need, and focus on your training guide for now. All right, Brad and I have a favorite slide in every presentation, and I think it's this one. Brad, if I spoke for you, sorry. We like to talk about backwards design. We're curriculum nerds, and so we have our students here on the left, and we are trying to get them across the finish line to meet those goals of health education that we talked about. That's the meat and potatoes of why we're here and why we do what we do. And right before they cross that finish line, as we start to design what we put in front of students, we talk about the standards. And so we have just done that. We're in the middle of this series right now. We're talking about Standard 7. We talk about the heat cat. We'll bring that back to light later. We talk about our state standards. And then right before we do that, where we kind of start with our planning is an assessment. So we look at what do we want students to know and do? What are they going to show me that they know, or we know as teachers that they can show us? What is our mastery and how does that look when we play it out in an assessment? So end in mind kind of concept. Brad's going to talk us through a little bit about what mastery looks like here for those assessments for Standard 7.
Yeah, so I use the middle school performance indicators as an example here. And I just wanted to show you a couple examples of what a mastery statement could look like, or a student-friendly I can statement. Notice how we're just breaking down that performance indicator in a very student-friendly language. So for example, I think that sometimes teachers have struggled with the demonstrate performance indicator. So we'll just look at performance indicator 3 here, demonstrate behaviors to avoid or reduce health risk to self and others. And it just simply breaks it down as I can demonstrate health behaviors that reduce health risk. I'll add here that if you've already selected your health practice, that it may be helpful to revise that language to maybe speak a little bit more specifically to that health practice. If you're working on the same health practice for the entire class, I know that some teachers really like to make it personal for the students and provide them choice of the health practice. And so then a more broad I can statement like it's listed here on the slide would be beneficial, because then the student can make it more specific to them and their health practice that they chose. But that's just an example. And when we get into the how am I going to know when a student has mastered that skill, we look at these different tools, these different opportunities that students are actually demonstrating and using those health practices. And so you can see here on example 2, students are creating a poster showcasing a specific health practice and how it is practiced in their daily life. The poster should include a visual and written understanding of the practice itself. It's going to represent a demonstration of the skill. And when students are using the poster to present, students will actually demonstrate the health practice. And so through this activity or this assessment tool, you as the teacher would clearly be able to identify whether that student has mastered that health practice and that skill or not. Again, I don't believe that a end of unit quiz or test is going to be appropriate for you to determine if a student has demonstrated or mastered a health practice or a health behavior. And so again, this is a great example of how you can assess your students in Standard 7.
Perfect. And Brad, on that assessment tool number 2 that you spoke about, the very last sentence said something about when presenting the poster, students will demonstrate the process. And I think that as teachers, when we see the verb demonstrate, that is very hard to evaluate or assess. It's not going to be in the multiple choice format like you just spoke about, but I do think that it's in the creation of a rubric and where your point getters are a little bit more heavy in the process. And so, demonstrating the health practice through the process, I think, is what students really need to be assessed on, because that's the verb, right? So there's a lot of rubrics that we can access with RMC Health as well. But anyway, I just wanted to point that demonstrate verb out again, because it is tricky to assess. But all right, so we're going to have you reflect for just a minute on your performance indicator and what students will be showing you that they definitely mastered this particular performance indicator. So take a moment, use your performance indicator, and on page 2 of your training guide, identify what your students will need to do to show you that they mastered this particular indicator. So pause your video if you need to and take some time there. Page 2. All right, here's our friendly picture again. So we're heading towards the goals. We've talked about standards, and we've got a wonderful assessment tool that we have in place. And now we're going to talk about some of our instructional planning. And through our instructional planning, we're going to outline some steps for you, and then we're going to give students some practice opportunities to really wrestle with that demonstrating piece. And so we can put the tools out there, we can have a nice cohesive step-by-step pattern that we need, but then let's give them opportunities to practice. And so Brad's going to walk us through how to marry this instructional planning with practice opportunities for our students to get to that mastery.
Thank you, Kim. So to start, we want our instruction to be broken down into these steps to help our students learn this skill. We must break the skill down. And so I love how RMC provides grade and age appropriate steps for each skill. So for example, for self-management, for personal responsibility, I just remind you, we had these two components. We had demonstrating the health practices, and then component 2, which is what we're still speaking on, which is personal responsibility. So these are steps for a pre-K through second grade student to learn and practice personal responsibility. So step 1 is just simply knowing what helps you be healthy, starting to recognize what a health practice is. Step 2 is do something healthy. I think these images and this easy language would be great to throw on a slide or poster for your students in the classroom. Step 3, make it a habit. Step 4, look back and learn. So you can see how this is very easy for a student to kind of use, and notice how it's a circle, it's a cycle, right? So it's constantly going. It's not something that we master and we leave alone. It's constantly going, and I love the cycle approach on these steps. For grades 3 through 5, identifying a need for responsibility. So understanding that I do need responsibility in my life, and try noticing some of the good from responsibility. Then we're getting into choosing a skill or strategy once we've identified the responsibility, and again, making it a habit, look back and learn. So as we move into secondary health, for grades 6 through 8, you're going to see again, step 1, it's important that we know what is personal responsibility, being able to identifying when it may change. So kind of understanding, okay, this is what I have been responsible for. This is maybe what I see in the future as I get older, me gaining this responsibility. Helping our students understand that it might feel like work at times. Responsibility is not always, it can sometimes feel like work, but I think it's important for us to talk about both sides. That it can feel like work, but it can also give us more control of our life. And there's lots of benefits of taking on more responsibility at times. And so that step 2 is once we've identified certain responsibilities, now these are the skills or strategies that are going to help us enhance those health practices when we are taking on that responsibility. And then again, step 3 and step 4 consistent, make it a habit, and reflect. And again, 9 through 12, same cycle as grades 6 through 8. And so that gives us some consistency with teaching to secondary health, which I like. Kim, anything you'd add to those steps?
I find it interesting the cyclical look of this. I think if you've seen any of our other training series, they're very linear. I love that they're cyclical for this self-management and the personal responsibility, because we may stay in step 1 for quite a while. And sometimes the cycle has to come back once you hit step 2. Oop, I need to go back and re-identify. Yep. So I love that cyclical look of things. So very helpful.
And I think it's important as students are going through this that these steps are visual. So quick shout out to RMC Health. They have these available to purchase as posters, double-sided. They're inexpensive. I think they're $14. You can purchase just your grade span steps, or you could throw this up on the slide and make it a warm-up activity for your students to create their own posters. Let them create their own images if you want. But I think it's important that we make these steps available kind of like as an anchor chart or a visual for our students as they're progressing through our year of activities. because this is going to be appropriate in so many different units, so many different skills and content areas, that this would be a great thing to have up in your classroom year round.
Great idea. Great tip. Some other tips. Great segue, Brad. One thing that it lends itself very nicely with self-management is to use project-based learning activities. We talked a little bit about that in some examples, but that it really leverages that process where students can show a process or a demonstration of. And so it's a little bit bigger than just a ticket out the door type thing. It's getting into a project and really digging into some health practices. So really try to leverage some project-based learning strategies as you start to teach this skill. That's one tip. And then another tip that I think is important for variety of learning styles and variety of cultures and students that we interact with is the fourth bullet down here, is to provide opportunities for different modes of that demonstration. A poster may not speak to every student. Standing up and sharing about a health practice verbally, not comfortable for some students. And so giving different ways that students can show this demonstration, I think is very critical when it's so personal. A lot of these are, but comic strip versus an essay, different things like that, acting out, verbally, singing, speaking. So providing different modes is a little bit, it's going to be best practice here for teaching self-management skills and letting them wrestle with that. So those are some tips that kind of jump out at me here. For any other ones, Brad, that spoke to you differently?
No, I think you said those both, which make a huge difference, make a really big difference.
Good.
So as we talked about the instruction, and now we're going to kind of get into a little bit more of how that instruction leads to practice opportunities. But these steps of personal responsibility have some sub-skills. And I think these sub-skills as a teacher make it easier for us to identify where our instruction should go next and how I can break it down even more to help my student be successful. And so, I mean, first, it just starts off with defining responsibility, just helping students understand what that is. We've talked a ton about identifying responsibilities. And then I think what we haven't really talked a lot about yet is connecting that responsibility to their health. So yes, a student understands I'm responsible for this, but do they understand how that connects to their health and what area of health? I think is what this sub-skill really helped me understand this standard even better. So you can see some of the vocabulary involved in this skill and some great guiding questions that could be used as class discussion or journal prompts. So we are going to move into some learning activities. I love the language of health literacy available here, but ultimately this suggested learning activity that I've chosen to kind of share is students are going to start off just creating a list of responsibilities that they're currently responsible for. And what I like about this is that sometimes students will take ownership when they know that peers have already taken ownership of a certain skill. And so I connect this to my oldest daughter. She had a cousin come visit her last summer. And at that point, we were still at the stage of probably babying her and still helping her get dressed in the mornings, helping her get dressed after bath time. And her cousin came to visit, and her mom was running in the half marathon that morning. And so I was helping the girls get ready. Mom had laid out cousin's clothes, and I said, okay, can I help you get changed into your day clothes? And she just grabbed her clothes, went to the bathroom, came out, and was all dressed and ready for the day. And me and Brinley, my daughter, looked at each other, and we were like, wait a second. So she had taken responsibility of that personal hygiene. She brushed her teeth. And I didn't have to teach my daughter anything. The next day, she just started getting herself ready. And so sometimes seeing a peer take responsibility of a health practice and behavior can make the difference. And so one here, we're just giving students the opportunity to identify, this is what I'm currently responsible for. And it's really simple, but it could lead to students taking more responsibility of their health simply by, this is what I'm currently responsible for. We're then going to start listing things how that's changed. What was I responsible for when I was in third grade? Let's list responsibilities that we can think of that we had in elementary school. We're speaking from a middle school point of view right now. This is a middle school suggested learning activity. I think it could also be done at the high school. And then let's reflect on how that's changed, what's changed so far, and then let's take it a step further. What's going to change when I go to high school, or what's going to change when I go to college? What other responsibilities am I going to have to take on? And then I think what students would really like to talk about, which could be a really powerful conversation, and then we're continuing to list here, is what responsibilities right now do I not have that I want? Because we know that at that middle school and high school age group, students start to want to have more ownership of some things and some responsibility of some things, but parents haven't given up that yet, or they're not old enough yet. Giving students the opportunity to kind of think about that, write those down, can kind of put a positive spin on responsibility, because sometimes it gets that hard work taste in your mouth. So what responsibilities do you want? And let's write those down. And then you can see on the right here, let's give students the opportunities to make a poster of these responsibilities that they have, that they want, and then give them the opportunity to kind of discuss within a small group or present to your class as a whole if your class is small enough. But again, we are just giving them the opportunities to really identify. Remember, at the middle school level, we're identifying what those responsibilities are. And then lastly, once they've made that poster, when they're presenting to their small group or the class, we're going to ask them to identify and explain, what part of your health is this helping? Like, is this connected to your physical health, your emotional or mental health, or prevention and risk management? And so we're trying to connect these responsibilities and health practices to a component of health. So now we're starting to get into the why. Why do you want ownership of this? Why is this important to your health? Because we have to bridge that. But we definitely, I think it's important to break it down. And so I hope that you can see in that example of how you could do that. A couple quick notes. If we're giving students the opportunity to have choice, which I think is important when doing these health practices, and asking students to demonstrate health practices, once you get to that part, it can be super impactful to conference with students in a one-on-one or small group basis. So if I know that Kim and two of her friends all chose hydration as a health practice that they wanted to identify and practice, then I can conference with those students as a small group and work with them. And how are you doing? Helping them reflect and learn, helping them maybe choose a menu of options of skills that they're going to select. Or if I know that there's a student that really chose maybe a sensitive topic, I'm going to conference with that student one-on-one, and I'm going to find time to do that. And so I think that was an important teaching note to provide, because not everything can be done whole group when talking about health practices.
The smaller the better in some cases, right? Absolutely. Brad, those were great examples on how to get this teaching progression flushed out with that 6-8 grade span. And thank you for the story about your daughter, cousins. A big win there, right?
That was a big win
for everybody. That's good stuff. Okay, we're going to give you an opportunity to reflect a little bit on your particular performance indicator and the teaching progressions that are associated with that. So take a reflective time here on page 3 and talk about what your instructional planning will look like. So if you look at those steps and the sub-steps and the sub-skills that are embedded in there, what will your practice opportunities look like to really have students demonstrate? And then how will you know when the students have mastered? So take a minute here, pause the video if you need to, and answer these 3 reflection questions on your training guide. All right, we have talked a lot about RMC Health and how fantastic they are. We have used a lot of the materials from the health skill guides. And so this is just kind of a snapshot of what we're talking about, where you can find these things. So each training guide or each skill guide has this by step And so remember, Brad said that there are two different components here for this standard, but step 1 blows it out. You'll see the subskills listed under that. It gets very gritty into what students will be showing you for mastery. There's some guiding questions, and then off to the right, there is some vocabulary that you can present early in this particular skill. And then there's also resource bank. There's some rubrics that I had mentioned as well. So that is just kind of a snapshot of the RMC Health Skill Guides. And so when we have talked about kind of getting some help for you to start to organize your thoughts here, we mentioned that this particular standard really connects to a lot of other standards. And so as you start to combine both teaching, practice of skill, and practice opportunities, a lot of these things can be seen in other skills. And I think really quickly about goal setting and how being a self-manager of your health practice can marry very nicely with goal setting and the personal practices that you need to take to set some appropriate health goals. Those two marry very nice. I think decision making marries very nice too. If you are self-managed, you can have that forward thinking on, you know, here are my health practices and I'm going to demonstrate those for a long life. I think they marry very well with all of our skills here. And so this was just a snapshot of all of our standards and skills. And then on top of the skills, we also marry with content, and Brad's given a lot of examples here. We talked about vaping, we talked about sexual health, we talked about just personal health and wellness in general, healthy eating, hygiene. So we could really make a case for any of these content connections as well. So this particular skill and standard really partners well across our whole health ed curriculum. And so it's just plugging in and taking some of these strategies and being very mindful about how and when to do that. So if you start to think about your connections for the indicator that you've been wrestling with, how can you connect that? And in your training guide on page 3, we ask you to marry that with some content, and you can pull up the heat cap modules and get very gritty about where in the content. But I also challenge you in the one of the side of this box here is to connect to maybe another skill or another standard. And so how can you use standard 7 comprehensively, content and skill? And so be pretty reflective there in your training guide and take a moment there. And that kind of wraps us up here for standard 7. And so we are there down at the bottom, and this has been part of our National Health Standards deep dive. So we have some other videos. If you haven't gone back and watched some of the why skills-based health ed or making that shift, very important videos there. And then there are also some instructional strategy videos that Brad and I can walk you through. But we've really enjoyed having you here today. We hope to see you in another session. Thanks for everything today, Brad.
Yeah, that was fun. Thank you for joining us.